Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local.
But let me get into. We could go on and on and on down these different digressions and pathways. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. But let me ask you first where your customers are located. Where geographically are your customers? I mean, you're an e-commerce business. You have broad distribution, but is there a concentration of people somewhere? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, our largest concentrations of customers are actually in places where there is very little specialty coffee, and we call
define specialty coffee in this case.
So specialty coffee is kind of like the highest tier of quality in coffee. There is a technical description of it, at least in terms of.
You mean they can't get it in the store? There's no cafes.
You can start to get some of it in small local stores. You can get it not in chain cafes, but in local cafes. It requires a very particular type of coffee sourcing. You don't buy like tens of thousands of pounds of it for one type of coffee bean. Like there are some coffees we've had where there's been 500 pounds of that coffee for the entire year for the entire world. So you're talking about small producers. You're talking about micro lots, super high quality. You can look at the beans and be like, oh, there's like someone did this with love. And it's generally more expensive. On average, it's about $40 per pound, and it goes up from there. So it's like a totally different, you can think of it as gourmet coffee, but the technical term is specialty coffee.
So where I got you off track. Where are your customers located roughly? You said in markets where they can't otherwise get specialty coffee.
Yeah, so we call them a coffee desert, where there might be tons of coffee, but by and large, it's kind of commodity coffee. There aren't specialty cafes. It's hard to find.
Starbucks is in that category. Starbucks is commodity coffee.
They're not considered specialty. They have some single origin coffees, but they're just not it's commodity. It's too big to be anything else.
Sure.
But one thing that's notable is within, I think, the first 2 months of operating, we had shipped to every state in the U.S. And what we thought, especially in the beginning, because we sourced coffee mostly from the Pacific Northwest back then. Again, now it's all over the country and all over the world. But we thought all of our customers would be like, Seattle folks who
urban hipsters.
Coffee. Yeah. And now we have clusters in the middle of Texas, in Ohio, in Western Massachusetts, in Florida, like all over the landscape. But there are particular clusters where it's hard to find, or maybe even impossible to find, that quality or that tier of coffee. And those are folks who, again, have gone from, I'm going to pick up a bag of Dunkin' on the way home and keep it in the freezer, to, spending real money on very difficult to find coffee and really enjoying it. And again, these are people, they don't have like a $2,000 espresso machine in their kitchen. A lot of them have like Mr. Coffee machines from the 80s or the 90s sitting in their kitchen, or they have very simple kettle and Chemex pour over setups. It's really for everyone. And part of the thing here is like democratizing access to a food product that otherwise is hard to find, and it has psychological barriers and it has fiscal barriers, and we want to make that experience available to everyone without feeling bad or not having it locally.
Do you have a typical customer profile? I mean, this is a sort of a marketing exercise, right? You could get into the conference room and you got the whiteboard and all of that. Are there a couple of personas or customer types that you see again and again, or is it really just all over the map, literally and figuratively?
So there is more of a skew when it comes to gift purchasers. That is more seasonal. We find there is more often women are buying for their families or for their husbands and for themselves, but we see more women typically than men. But short of that, like we try not to target a particular customer segment, because I walk into any crowded room in the world and strike up a conversation
Well,
about coffee.
everybody loves coffee. Everybody loves
Everybody has
coffee.
an opinion. Everybody loves coffee. And so
Right.
we think if the demand is everywhere, let us fish everywhere.
Well, one of the great challenges that marketers face in this, notwithstanding the sort of monopoly, Amazon and Google and certain other very highly concentrated consumer destinations, the world of marketing has become more complex and fragmented over time. There's multiple social media platforms and video, multiple formats and content and so on and so forth. How do you acquire customers? I mean, you guys have had a fair amount of media coverage, including national TV coverage, which I'm sure is very helpful. But what is your chief customer acquisition channel, if there is one, or a couple of top channels?
Yeah. So first, a note about the sort of media attention. Last year we had, I think it was like over 1,000 pieces of earned media. But what's interesting is that it is more
It's a lot
about
of links. It's a lot of
yeah,
links.
yes. So it's more about authority, whether that's kind of SEO authority or it's brand authority, than it is like, oh, you're on the Today Show. We sell a little bit more, and it's great. But really, it's about conferring authority in multiple ways
Well,
on the brand.
that's a brand building. That's a brand building thing. I mean, there's a conversation that I get into with people from time to time is performance versus brand, right? And there's always this sort of dilemma within marketing departments about how much to invest in brand building, which is a longer time horizon versus next quarter and hitting our numbers and lead gen and all of that. Um, so, you guys are slowly over time, over a decade, building a brand, which at the end of that process or in the midst of that process, as it builds momentum, really yields enormous benefits. Um, I mean, there's a big difference between a beloved brand and a kind of generic supplier of something. Not taking the product out of it, which is, of course, the point here. But
Yeah, and I think one of the things they never tell you in e-commerce is that you can pull every trick in the book. On a certain level, you need tincture of time before you're going to get there. And this is also part of scaling from a marketing perspective. Um, you can look in 1,000 places, and they will tell you the thing or things you need to do to double your sales or to,
right.
like triple your customer inflow or whatever it is. But unless you're at that right moment in time, those things are not going to work. And we found some things that worked really well when we were small no longer work, and some things that we tried and they had no hope of doing anything for us, a couple of years later they blew it out of the park. And
So
that's
give me a concrete example of the two categories. Something that worked well when you were small that no longer works, and something that you couldn't do when you were small that you can do now.
yeah. So a good example of a good example would be co-promotion with things like giveaways to get more emails on board. So when we started as a brand, we could not do this with anyone because we didn't have a large email list. We had to build that really slowly. No one wanted to partner with us until we got to 25,000, which back then seemed like a lot, and now it's very much in the rearview mirror. So no one would work with us, but everyone's like, oh, you got to do co-promotion with other brands and you'll bring in lots of emails and all that is good. It did not work for us until we reached a point where we had 25,000 folks on our list, and where the brand was kind of, we'd call people up and they'd be like, oh yeah, I've heard of you, or I know a subscriber or whatever. And then it worked gangbusters for a period of maybe 3 years. And that was also the period in which there were platforms built around this. Dojo Mojo, as an example, is still around. And for that relatively long span, it worked beautifully. We had a couple 100,000 people on our list. We would partner up with other growing brands. Everyone would win. We'd give away a trip or a year's free coffee, and it worked beautifully. Now that tactic does not work at all for us. And part of it is that it's kind of been done and done and done and done. Part of it is the platforms no longer fit someone of our size, because we just
You're
have.
too big now.
it's not that we're too big. It's that like if we're going to do a co-promotion, we will call a brand and we will do a co-promotion, and it's got to be worth it for both brands. And so you cycle in and out of these phases of scale. And what I find amazing is, like you and I get emails every day about the thing you need to do to improve your Q4 or to double your conversion rate or whatever, whatever the pitch is. And every single one of those tactics may or may not work depending upon where you are in your brand growth and your company growth. And it's almost impossible to know which ones are going to go at what time until you try them all.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of a marketing maturity model, sort of, and it makes
Yeah.
it makes a lot of sense. So, what do you use today for customer acquisition? I mean, what have you found, or what at this moment is working for you, and what have you chosen to ignore
Hmm.
consciously? Because obviously, people can't do everything well. This is one of the big challenges: is concentrate over here and ignore this other thing. But there's a fear of not having a presence everywhere because this is, the conventional wisdom. You have to be here and here and here and here. I would run these small business boot camps when I was at the local search association, and many of the parties that would speak would come up and say things, and these are small businesses in the audience, and they would come up and say, well, you have to be on Google, and you have to be on this one, and you have to be on that one, and you have to be on here. And it was like 15 things, and there was just no chance that was even feasible. So what are you guys doing that you're consciously saying yes to and consciously saying no to?
Yeah, so I'll mix and match here, but a couple of thoughts. Amazon is more of a channel, but now with like Amazon Media, it's kind of both. Amazon used to be a huge source of growth for us, but they changed the rules around who could be Prime if you were fulfilling your own product. So coffee
Yeah,
is perishable.
they're compelling people to use their own logistics, right? Pretty much
Yeah, and that
for
that switched.
visibility.
Yes, it switched dramatically a couple of years ago. So, since coffee is perishable, we always did seller fulfilled prime. Our metrics were great. It was a great source of growth for us. They changed the metrics. We really were forced, if we wanted to stay prime and win in the buy box, we had to use FBA. And so we've made that transition. But it's much harder to grow on FBA for a couple of reasons. I'm sure you know most of them. One thing we found is that like the contribution, like the actual contribution revenue it's severely impacted. Like if you're going to sell directly, you make more of the money, there are less fees, you don't have to advertise it, FBA fees, storage fees, transport. I mean, all of that. And that channel has changed over time. And so they're a great partner for us, but we've kind of put a box around it. Right. And so it is what it is. It does really well, but we're not looking at that as a growth channel.
You're not investing there.
Not in the same way. And I think were they to make some tweaks, like we would go hard there, but macroeconomically, I don't see them doing
Well,
that.
after you testify at the antitrust trial, they might not let you back in.
Yeah,
Well,
well,
that's an antitrust issue. That's one of the issues in the government's case against Amazon, is that they force people to adopt their systems and pay those fees, and they use their coercive power to get those concessions out of small sellers. But this let's not go too far down that path. What's something that you're using now with success?
yeah. So a really great example is affiliates. So affiliate, the volume is low, but the return on ad spend is through the roof. And over time, you learn which affiliates work and which don't. It's not a question of what platform you're on. You can use technology from the 90s to track it. We probably do, but that's a great example where, like, if we could get more of that tomorrow, we would take all of it. So great return on ad spend, but the volume is low. So that kind of has a box around it. Another area we've started investing in this year is not so much influencers pitching BeanBox as creating content about BeanBox and sharing it. So we're not relying on the revenue from them, but these influencers are part of a platform, and that platform gives us access to the content they generate. That content then gets used on our own social, but it also gets used as ad creative for Facebook. And on Facebook, ad creative makes all the difference. So we are investing heavily there. And that's been working really, really well for us.
How do you is this through a formal sort of transactional relationship? You reach out to the influencers and there's some sort of agreement. How do you stimulate the influencers in your case to engage with the product?
Yeah, we're using a platform. My co-founder knows the name. It escapes me right now, but essentially it's a platform. What we provide to the influencer is we don't pay them for a post. We send them product and they
And
experience the
they
product.
talk about it. And they talk about
They
it.
talk about it. They make content about it. Someone made it was like a minute and a half black and white film about like getting the best coffee and hating going to the supermarket. I mean, it's very, very creative. And all of that turns into content that we can use on social and we can use
That's part of
for
the
ad.
package. That's part of the
Yes.
package. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's
So,
working really well. And then the platform depends on the time of year. Again, like Amazon is brilliant at holiday, harder during the rest of the year. Google is good for selling individual bags of coffee year round, but where it really shines is gifts during holiday peak.
and
Facebook,
those are shopping ads that you're doing for on
yep,
Google.
that's
Yeah.
exactly right. That's great for gifts. Facebook has become really good for acquiring subscribers, where instead of measuring ROAS, which is what we do with gifts primarily, then we look at CAC to LTV. So we also have two primary measurement models that we use depending upon whether it's acquiring a subscriber or acquiring on a gift campaign. And of course, the beauty is in many cases, you can bring someone in on a gift campaign, but they will become a subscriber. And you can bring someone in on a subscriber campaign and they may need a gift. And so we're fishing in both pools at the same time.
So what about TikTok? We talked a little bit about that previously when we were having our other conversation. You guys are seeing a lot of discussion about Beanbox on TikTok, but you don't have a official presence on TikTok. Is that right?
I I believe we do. We're not investing in it.
But you're getting a lot of exposure through this kind of influencer model where they're talking about it and they're sort of bestowing credibility on the brand. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't invest heavily there. We know some of our customers are there.
Are you tracking it at all in any way?
We took the TikTok tag off of our website.
So no.
Nope.
And you said to me earlier that you really aren't investing very much in SEO at this point. Is that
Yeah.
a fair characterization?
Yeah. So another really surprising learning is that we used to, when we were much smaller, like every day, we're like, what do we need to do to improve our SEO? What content do we need to create? Do we need to have a blog? Do we need to redesign the blog? Are people coming in? Are they going from the blog to the site? Are they then becoming buyers? Are buyers looking at the blog? Does the blog have the right content with the right keywords? Should we use WordPress? Should we have another tool? Which company should we work with? Do we need to work on technical SEO or non-technical SEO and content? We constantly we worried about that and we fretted. And past a certain point, the way we see it now is there are only a couple things. We create authentic content that is meaningful to the stuff we sell and the people who buy it. That's easy. That's like content authority and authenticity that Google talks about. Number two, technical SEO. Like you got to not screw that up. And the third is make the site as fast as you can. And like every quarter I wake up and I do the Core Web Vitals and I look at Lighthouse and I'm like, oh, we've slipped a little bit. Let's work on it. Seasonally, we tune that up. So it's like be fast, be authoritative, have good content, but you can only do that past a certain sort of trust measure of your brand. Whereas when we started, we had to worry constantly about SEO. Now we could spend weeks working on it and it would certainly improve things. But the question is whether that improvement would be
Well,
material to the business.
right. Are,
And
are, are most of the search queries that you guys show up in, are they brand queries versus sort of category queries like specialty gifts or coffee gifts or sort of generic category terms? I mean, what's the if you've looked at that, is it have you seen over time more and more direct navigational or brand searches?
Primarily where we win is on brand and category. There is some amount of long tail, but it's a pretty short long tail.
So what is the category that you rank for?
Coffee gifts,
Or
coffee subscriptions. And we
but
even used to, like, we would look at our ranking literally every day. Even though you're not supposed to, we'd be like, oh, we went up, we went down, we went up, we went down. Now we know we're going to share that. It's going to fluctuate over time. And because we have a portfolio of sources of traffic, everything from word of mouth to flyers that go in the boxes, we're less preoccupied with that. So long as we're within range, we feel like we're doing okay.
have you guys reduced your ad spend over time as your brand has grown, or have you maintained it?
No, I mean, part of what we're doing, last year and this year is we're trying to be much more efficient. So the idea is maintain a top line, improve the middle by way of gross margin, and then spend less. And so spend less on acquisition marketing, spend less on everything. And so we have intentionally decreased ad spend. Now, you get to a certain place where you end up starving because if you have a supportable lifetime value, call it a 2-year LTV, that's meaningful and material to your business, where you're not losing money, then you would be silly not to invest in that. And we've had to walk a really fine line between investing heavy there and making sure that our expenses are not crazy.
You you would be surprised at how many sophisticated marketers don't track their customer acquisition costs and don't know their customer lifetime value. I
I
mean,
would
it's
be
a, it's a,
surprised.
you would not be surprised. It's a. I mean, we did Near Media did an agency survey last year, and what on this point, a majority of these agencies, which range from an individual consultant to 500 plus,
Yeah.
a majority of those folks don't know their lifetime value, don't know their acquisition cost. That level of ignorance goes down, of course, as you get into the larger agencies, but it still exists. But it's the majority who don't track it.
Yeah, we've heard. I mean, we talk to people about this all the time. Like, one thing we find is sometimes people will be talking about LTR and they'll call it LTV, and we'll say, well, what's your margin? They'll be like, well, what does that matter? Our LTV is X, and we say, well, unless you consider your margin, you're really talking about your LTR, and that's a whole nother thing because really you're talking about your contribution.
R is revenue top line.
Yeah, R is top line, and V is
Yeah,
post your COGS.
yeah.
So we find that, and then also if you're new, when you talk about an LTV, like first of all, it has to be period constrained, so it has to be a 1 year or 2 year LTV. But we also find people where they're still in their kind of modeling phase, and they're like, look, we can afford to spend X as our cost for acquisition because we imagine that if we extrapolate, we're going to have a 2 year LTR or LTV of Y. And they're modeling that and they don't really know. Whereas, after 9 years, we know what our 1 year LTV or 2 year or 3 year,
Yeah.
and we know what the cohorts look like over time. And so I think you get as you grow and scale, you get a much better sense of what your real ratios are and how much you can spend to acquire.
We're coming up on the end of the we're approaching an hour, which is usually twice as long as these things go, but it's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about. So I just want to ask you a couple more questions. One
Yeah.
is like, where do you see this? Where do you see this going, sort of in general? Is it just sort of incremental growth? Well, 26% is not incremental, but is it just kind of keep going steady as she goes, or do you foresee some departure of some kind when you hit the next level of scale?
Yeah, I think as we've grown, we've always walked a fine line between investing forward and growth and trying to actually make a business that can be sustainable. We're still walking that line because, most important is don't screw it up. If you have a product market fit and people love what you do and you have a real brand that you're a custodian of, the most important thing is don't screw that up. And so you want to draw a balance between like being sustainable and investing forward, which in many cases means taking a loss. right? So we still navigate that all the time, and especially when you have a seasonality, it can be very, very tricky. What we want to do is we want to grow. We want to grow the presence of the brand, and ultimately, what we care about is like number one, do we have
quality.
yes. Number one, do we have a sustainable business? Number two, is the quality of our products such that it continues to make our customers really happy? And then number three is, like, how do we carve a path to make it so that people across America, when they think about great coffee, they think about BeanBox. And if we do all those things, quality, sustainable business, and mind share, when people think about great coffee at home, then that's super valuable over time. And we just want to build that every year.
So final question. I had a whole set of questions around your crowdfunding initiative, which is going on right now, which we can put a link to in the on the page where the podcast is hosted, if you wish.
Yes, thanks.
But we're not going to talk about that because we're at the end here. That's a whole another interesting conversation. But what advice would you give younger Matthew Berk at the beginning of this cycle? So knowing what you know, having had this experience, all the challenges and the learning curve and all the experience. So 10 years ago, or 9 years ago, you're at the very beginning of this. What's your advice to the younger version of yourself?
I mean, I think it's pretty simple. It's like when you're in a startup, from the moment you wake up until the moment you're done, which is usually never, you are in a knife fight. It is a war of all against all, and that is the startup life. And the knife that you use in year one is not the same knife that you use in year 9. And every day you have the opportunity to make a material impact on your business, no matter how large it gets. And that's the nature of being in it. And the longer you're in it, the more you know, and the more you realize what you don't know. And what you don't know shifts as you grow. So it's kind of like the knife fight philosophy, which is if you want to be in a startup and you want to come up that curve and scale and go through all the highs and the lows, then you have to realize that it's not a ride, it's not a journey, it's a war. And it's a very long war. It's not a short meteoric rise to everyone's happy and walks away wealthy. It's a long, slow, arduous war. And you have to be ready to kind of do that every single day. And I don't know.
So your advice is moderate your expectations and be very, very patient and diligent and persistent.
I think it's focus on the opportunity, even while you're in that knife fight every day.
Okay. All right. Well, Matthew Berk, thank you very much for talking to me, taking so much time out. I think it's a fascinating, your story is fascinating because you bring multiple points of view to this. And, we'll put the links to BeanBox. I'm not an affiliate of yours, but we'll put the links to BeanBox and your crowdfunding on the website.
Thank you, Greg. I'll also give you a code if any listeners want to go and try our coffee. We'll save a bunch.
I wasn't going to ask for that, but some people I'm sure will be interested.
You got it.
Okay. All right. Thanks again, Matthew, and we will talk again in the future.
Thanks so much, Greg. Be well.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.